In the twilight of a war-torn nation, a single moment of desperation upended everything. A famous actor, beloved on stage, a president walking into a theater for an evening of entertainment. A shot, a leap, a nation in shock. This is the story of John Wilkes Booth, his flight through the shadows, and the final hours of a man hunted. We follow the trail of intrigue, betrayal, and capture, into the smoke of barns, the hush of small farmhouses, and the glare of armed soldiers beyond the Potomac. What drove him? And how did his escape unravel in just 12 days? Join us as we trace the last act of one of America's darkest chapters.
From stage to conspiracy.
On the stage, he was adored. John Wilkes Booth had traveled the United States, from New Orleans to Chicago, Boston to Washington, as a leading actor. He commanded audiences. He watched his own fame grow. But behind the curtain of acclaim stirred something darker, a fierce devotion to the losing cause of the Confederacy, a growing hatred for the president he believed had doomed his people. As the war ground to an end and the Confederate capital fell, Booth's ambition shifted. He once plotted to abduct the president. When that failed, an assassin's resolve took shape. In his diary he wrote that our country owed all her troubles to him, and God simply made me the instrument of his punishment. He told friends the speech President Lincoln gave on April 11th was the last he will ever give. Booth's transformation from celebrated performer to conspirator was complete. The tension is unimaginable. The war's finale rings across the land. Booth's beloved stage becomes his platform for the destiny he has decided to shape. The man who mastered the limelight now plans a final, terrible performance with far graver consequences. In that moment, the curtain drops on one life and rises on another, the fugitive.
The fateful night at Ford's.
April 14, 1865. A night meant for leisure turned into history. President Abraham Lincoln attended a performance at Ford's Theater in Washington with his wife and friends. Booth, known to the theater and comfortable in its halls, entered the presidential box. He pulled a pistol. A single shot. Lincoln struck down. Chaos erupted in the darkened theater. At one moment he was the admired actor. In the next, he leapt 12 feet from the box to the stage, spur entangled on a flag, leg wounded, and shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always to tyrants. Then he mounted his horse and fled into the night. The head of the nation had been assassinated. The war's final act had become a catastrophe. The captain of the ship had been shot over the bow. Now begins the flight. The man who vaulted from applause to infamy rides eastward as the nation reels. The assassin has become a fugitive. His name echoes in every street and alley. Soldiers and detectives mobilize. The biggest manhunt in history takes shape. It will not end until a barn burns and a body falls.
Across the Potomac, flight begins.
With the city ablaze in shock, Booth rode south, slipping through Virginia's countryside. He crossed the Potomac, evading the encroaching net of Union troops. Alongside him was his co-conspirator David Harold, and a small circle of sympathizers hidden in plain sight. They stopped at safe houses, changed horses, wiped their tracks. But the dragnet closed. Nearly 1,000 Union soldiers poured into the manhunt, commandeering resources, questioning townsfolk, searching farms. Booth's fame now betrayed him. Acquaintances recognized him. Faces remembered. With each hour, the wilderness around him narrowed. The lush forests and tobacco farms of Virginia became his refuge and his trap. He sheltered in the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd, his leg splinted, his body weary. His mind raced. The war was over. The nation demanded justice, and Booth knew he was hunted. In the darkness of the night, the fugitive watched, waited. Every creak of a floorboard, every distant hoofbeat set his pulse racing. The grandiosity of his plan had brought him here, to terrorized flight and shadowed fear. The runaway stage star, the man who sought vengeance, now counted minutes in the wilderness. The final performance had begun. Hide, move, survive.
Shelter and betrayal in the woods.
Booth and Harold found temporary respite in the deep woods and tobacco farms of southern Virginia. The farmland offered quiet barns, dense cover, slack patrols, but also fearful neighbors, whispers among freedmen, and the constant risk of exposure. Booth wrote phrases in his diary, "Our cause being almost lost, something decisive and great must be done." But the decisive moment had come and gone. Now it was survival. The courage that carried him into the theater was pressed into service for hiding, for waiting, for fear. By day they moved. By night they slept in stolen bunkers, barns, or cabins. The landscape was serene and deadly. The war was officially over, but the battle for Booth's capture surged. Uniformed troops, detectives, even civilian volunteers converged. Farms were searched, dogs sent out, leads followed. On April 24th, they learned that Booth might be hiding near the small Virginia town of Port Royal. His time was running out. A network of conspirators, once sound in their loyalty, faltered under fear. The landscape shifted from shelter to trap. Booth measured each breath. He heard the crack of twigs, the distant voices of men hunting. The man who had once been a star now huddled in a barn, pain in his leg, sweat on his brow. The dance of freedom was turning into the final act of his tragic downfall.
Cornered at the Garrett farm.
The final tableau approached on April 26th. Booth, weakened and desperate, hid with Harold at the farm of Richard H. Garrett near Port Royal, Virginia. Around dawn, Union intelligence traced them to the location. Lieutenant Edward P. Doherty led a cavalry squad through the mist to the farmhouse. They surrounded the tobacco barn. Harold surrendered. Booth refused. He said he preferred to come out and fight. The soldiers ordered the barn to be set afire. Flames licked the wooden frame. Inside, Booth sat with his pistol, wounded and defiant. Suddenly a shot rang. Sergeant Boston Corbett fired, against orders. The bullet struck Booth in the neck. A leader fallen. The fugitive's miracle of flight ended in a blaze of smoke. Dragged from the barn, Booth lay on the porch of the Garrett farmhouse. He could no longer move. He asked the soldier to raise his hands to his face so he could see them. With his last breath he whispered, "Tell my mother I die for my country." Soon his last words, "Useless, useless." At 26 years old, a once great actor's life faded. The chase was over. The nation had its man. Yet the cost, psychological, cultural, moral, would linger.
Aftermath and reflection.
In the wake of the barn, silence and sorrow descended. Booth's body was identified, his remains transported back to Washington for autopsy, then later to family graves. The nation mourned Lincoln, but also wrestled with the meaning of Booth's act. A man of acclaim had become a villain, the rebel disguised as hero. His diary, his photographs, his letters, all uncovered the shifting motives, not just loyalty to the South, but ambition, disappointment, a hunger for infamy. In homes across the Union and the defeated South, people asked, who was John Wilkes Booth? An actor? A soldier? A fanatic? A failed patriot? He died, but he left questions. The war that ended with Appomattox Courthouse also ended with a shot in a theater. A nation scarred, yet healing. The pursuit cost lives, energy, resistance. The psychological war ran on. Detectives pursued co-conspirators. A trial followed. Conspirators hired lawyers, made offers to betray. The architecture of justice creaked and strained, and through it all the shadow of the manhunt hung. Some argued the body might not even have been his. Myth sprang up in the ashes. Conspiracy followed name. A theater star turned assassin, turned hunted, turned myth.
Legacy of an Assassin, Nation's Healing.
Years passed. The Civil War receded into history, but the reverberations of Booth's act did not. The nation reimagined itself. President Lincoln's martyrdom became mythic. The theater, the gun, the leap, all became icons. In textbooks, in memorials, in the hearts of Americans, the story of Booth serves as a warning. When fame meets fanaticism, the result can be devastating. The quest for vengeance, when untethered from reason, ends in ruin. And yet the story also asserts something else: the resilience of a nation. Within days of the assassination, the machinery of government kept moving. The Union survived. Law caught the conspirators. Justice weighed in. The barn fire may have ended Booth's flight, but it began a process of healing. Over decades, the families of victims and perpetrators grappled with loss and memory. The theater changed. Security tightened. The idea of a president under threat became part of the national consciousness. Today, when we look back at John Wilkes Booth, we see more than the man who fired the shot. We see the mirror of a country wounded but not broken. The flicker of a stage life turned to shadow reminds us how fragile fame is, how fierce conviction can be, and how long the after-echo of violence reverberates through generations.
Final thoughts: the man, the moment, the memory.
In the end, John Wilkes Booth is a figure of contradictions. A celebrated actor, a family man, a Confederate sympathizer, an assassin. Just 26 years old, his life ended, but his impact endured. The moment his bullet found Lincoln did not simply change one man's destiny. It altered the arc of a nation emerging from civil war. The 12-day chase, the network of conspirators, the smoky barn, and the broken leg, all become part of an American myth. But behind the myth is a real story of hubris, desperation, and the final act of a man who believed he was making history. As we conclude, we are reminded that history often pivots on a decision, a misstep, a leap into darkness. The stage lights fade, the curtain falls, the audience scatters, and the aftermath begins. What does the story of Booth tell us about justice, about vengeance, about fame? It tells us that even the most brilliant-seeming life, when pointed towards destruction, burns out quickly. And yet the memory lingers. The theater remains. The graves remain. The photograph remains. We remember because we must, not to glorify the act, but to learn from it,